The rise of thanks, Brian. The rise of the developer community. That's what we're talking about today. Before we dive in, hey everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Brian, and I'm pronouncing the Y specifically so that we don't confuse me with Brian. I'm a senior developer advocate over at Orbit.love. Orbit's a platform that helps community builders build what we call high gravity communities. We may chat a little bit about that, but primarily today we're going to be talking about community in general. You can find out more about me if you're interested. I'm at brob on Twitter. brob.dev is where my website is. You can find out more about Orbit if you want to. Orbit Model on Twitter. Orbit.love on the web. But the succinct version of who I am, I've been working on the web in some capacity for about 15, 16 years now. But more than that, I've been building and fostering technical communities for a long, long time. So long ago, in fact, that the only image I have is a black and white image. That's not entirely true. We had this as a promotional image. I guess it was for the art house feel of it. I don't know. But seriously, I've been building tech communities for about 10 years. This photo is actually taken from a code pen challenge for a user group I ran. This was a couple years into it. We got to start experimenting with new formats aside from just your standard pizza and a talk format. So today we're going to talk about something that I'm obviously pretty passionate about. If I've been doing some form of it for 10 years, we're going to talk about developer communities. And the reason that I want to talk about this, and we're going to frame it as just community in general a little bit, is because it's a very, very hot topic. Every product for the past decade has either wanted to build or had a community, and not just developer communities. If you had any product or service, someone somewhere was telling you to have a community. So let's talk a little bit about why, and we're going to do it in a little bit of framing. I have two historical contexts that we're going to talk through, and I've got three hot takes that we're going to talk through, because I think that every presentation should at least have one, so I'm giving you triple the value on that. Let's dive in. So the first context I want to talk about is kind of millennial old. It is the idea that humans in general are communal creatures. We thrive on community. Historically, evolutionarily, we thrive as a species because of community. But what does that really mean? And I think to get there, we have to first define what the heck a community even is. Put very, very, very simply, a community is a group of people that share something, right? That something could be goals, it could be passions, it could be interests, games, even locality, and oftentimes multiple of these things wrapped into one thing. At Orbit, we like to talk about three archetypes of communities. We like to talk about communities of play. So if you're into gaming, maybe you're in a Discord about a specific game, communities of practice, all looking to learn and grow, and communities of product. Product companies typically, as I've said, nowadays have some sort of community that spawns up around them. So historically speaking, evolutionarily speaking, when we think of evolution, we think of this kind of idea of survival of the fittest, right? This really carnal thing, right? But does that even really make sense in a human capacity? Humans aren't very fast. We're not very strong. We're not at all equipped for extreme temperatures or really equipped for much of anything. Now, we picked up tool use early on. Our ancestors did, and that was great. And we had, good brain formation, and that really helped. But I think what really separated us as a species and made us fit, right, was the ability to form larger and larger communities and rapidly adapt, not just biologically, but also culturally. And there's actually a scientific research paper that was written in 2009 from Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson. Now, I have a degree in philosophy, so I love these kinds of papers. But it's called Evolution or Culture and the Evolution of Human Cooperation. And now when we think about cooperation, we think of it as kind of maybe a hippy dippy thing, right? Like we're all just working together towards one big goal. But they defined it a little differently. And I thought it was a really interesting way that they defined it. They said that cooperation is costly behavior performed by an individual that increases the payoff of others. And that's a really interesting framing, not just for humanity, but also for communities in general. It allows us to grow bigger, stronger, and more diverse cooperative communities. It allows us to work much, much better as a species. And you might even say that communities are humanity's strength. Community is the underlying nature of humanity. And that leads us to my first hot take of the day, that communities always exist. That is, whether or not you create them, whether or not you participate actively in them, they always exist. So right now, we're here taking part in the CFE community. There's a broader technical community that we're taking part in. We're in Brian's community. We're in Brian's community. I hope you heard the different pronunciation there. We're in all these communities together. And to a degree, you're also currently taking part in Orbit's community. So it's always here, and it's always something that happens. So whether or not we actively guide them is something to think about. So let's do a quick thought experiment about how this exists in the broader development world, right? Let's say that I make the next hot JavaScript framework. There's 8,000 of them already. What's 8,001? That's what we do, right? We create new JavaScript frameworks in the front end world. I mean, I don't, because I'm not that good a programmer, but we're pretending. So I think it's fine to go that direction. I mainly make it for me, probably. I start and it automates a couple pieces of work that I need to get done on a regular basis. Maybe I talk about it on Twitter a couple times, nothing major. And someone based on that picks it up and starts using it for their work. Whoopsie, we have a community now, right? That's two people that are sharing usage of this framework. Now, maybe I, as a JavaScript developer, just want to write code. I don't want to manage all the trappings of a community. The community still exists. I'm just not optimizing for a good community anymore. Now, this is probably not a great road to go down. And this leads us to our first corollary on our hot takes, which is if communities exist either way, which we've already kind of said, an ignored community can very, very quickly and almost definitely become a bad community. As my amazing JavaScript framework grows in popularity, a community is going to form up around it because it's awesome, right? But if I continue to ignore it and all the issues that come into GitHub and all the questions that come through Twitter and all of the things that pop up around it, it will eventually devolve into a really bad place. And there's probably going to be a lot of hard feelings around it. And honestly, I will probably be the worse for that, both professionally, probably personally to a degree. And honestly, if I wanted my JavaScript framework to take off, I would probably be in trouble for that. And that leads me directly to my hot take number 2, which is community is integral to developer experience, right? So I want to do another thought experiment around this. Your community is as important to the design, the API, the UI, the UX of your product or your framework or your open source project or your meetup or what have you, right? So let's do another thought experiment. You're looking for a new API that you need to use, right? So you look at services that are available. You're building out a couple proofs of concept to test out the two best looking services that you found. You want to see how these both kind of react in real world scenarios. When you're building them out, you stumble a few times, right? Because it's a new API, it's a new syntax. You're not really familiar with it. And we all know what it means when you stumble while you're working on code. You go and do some copy and paste work, right? You head over to Google. Maybe you go directly over to Stack Overflow. One service has hundreds of helpful posts with plenty of copy and pastable code, all on Stack Overflow, ready for you to try out. One has 2 posts. Moreover, you look on Google even more and you find dozens and dozens of helpful blog posts for one about how to set things up all the way from the beginning all the way through the end on sites like dev.to, CSS Tricks, Smashing Mag, personal blogs. The other has like a company blog and some docs. Which do you choose? For my money, I go with the one that has the amount of educational resources and the amount of copy and pastable code that I need to get my job done. This doesn't even go in right? To how helpful service forums can be, or GitHub issues that you can find directly tied into a product or service, Discords and Slacks and live chat communities. But how does this happen, right? How do developers specifically look at forming up these communities around products, frameworks, code snippets, what have you? For that, we've got our second historical context, the overall history of the developer community. Why did we get to where we had this critical mass of developer communities that we see today? Well, there's a solid modern history to how developer communities have been coming through. So I absolutely adore this quote. It's theoretically by Pablo Picasso. Everywhere I've seen it, it's been Pablo Picasso. There's some debate about some other people who may have said it. But it says when art critics get together, they talk about form and structure and meaning and kind of these highfalutin things. When artists get together, they talk about where you can buy cheap turpentine. So not only does it continue to kind of bear out our first historical context, I mean, look, we basically have two sets of communities here with two very distinct purposes. But it also has kind of our second historical context as well. It identifies a little bit this idea of a maker community, an artist community. Maker communities are typically communities of practice. They can be communities of product, and they're often places where the nitty gritty gets discussed, right? Because we often run screaming from highfalutin language, from marketing language. We as developers don't really enjoy that sort of thing. And so the history of our specific type of maker community dates back a long time, actually. We can certainly kind of talk through the entirety of human creative community, but we can probably skip ahead into the 70s and 80s. And hardware clubs, not necessarily software clubs, there wasn't that much software at the time, were beginning to crop up. In fact, the original Apple computer, the Apple One, was brought to the Homebrew Computer Club in Palo Alto. They were meeting about technology that literally almost no one cared about at the time. And they did it because they had found a group of people that cared about these same things that they cared about things that literally only a hobbyist could love at the time, with very little practical application outside of it. So that was kind of these original like meetup groups that kind of spawned up. But along the same timeline, we started seeing bulletin boards coming up and cropping up in this nascent internet thing that was beginning to take shape. And the first technical in-person and virtual communities were born from this. In fact, if you go a little further back in time, we had something called user groups that began even before this. The first user group was actually, what was it called? It was from the Share user group, which was based on aviation hardware on IBM mainframes. So there was a focus on that. And that actually still exists today. The Share user group that was founded in 1955 actually still exists today. And it was one of the first like product focused tech communities out there. So really this was like-minded folks self-organizing. It was a volunteer thing. And this would continue into the 90s. It would continue into the aughts. And most cities that had a decent size community in general, decent sized locality, would see user groups pop up around various languages, whatever the language of the era was, whether we're talking Perl or Basic or whatever it was. You saw software, as software ate the world, software user groups kind of bubbling up in localities. Now, there are a lot of things that have helped us along the way, and there are a lot of companies that have done this and really pushed forward, and a lot of communities that have done this. But I think that a big shift happened in 2003. It's a shift that drastically affected the web, but it also affected the way that companies viewed their communities in a lot of ways. And I think it was kind of the beginning of this revolution that we kind of see ourselves in. And that was WordPress launched in 2003. Nowadays, I'm not the biggest proponent of WordPress, but back in 03, 04, 05, it was like revolutionary in the way that you could build websites. It was great. I mean, I was specifically working inside of WordPress for at least the first like 5 years of my professional career in a lot of ways. Beyond how it shaped the early creator web, though, it also helped push forward open source and push forward community. It was built and taught and advocated for specifically by the community. And when a company formed up around WordPress, when Automatic came in, they knew that was their strength. They knew, and they supported and they pushed forward with that. And within the first 3 years, the newly formed Automatic company hosted its first WordCamp event. And that was in, I think, LA. And from that very first meetup, they sponsored local volunteer-led user groups across the world. And now the WordCamp conferences there are over 1,100 of them. And that is on all 6 populated continents and in 65 countries and a whole bunch of cities. Um, and that's all supported in some way by Automatic and by the WordPress core. They sponsor like meetup accounts, they sponsor pizza, they sponsor all these different things to make this happen. And that's because they know this community-centric growth mindset is what allowed them to take, like, was it like 43% powering the web at this point? It also guarantees that people new to using WordPress have literally tens of thousands of people who are eager to help them learn locally, remotely, virtually, whatever it is. It also means that you've got tons of advocates. The job of educating a user base globally over tens of thousands of people is nearly impossible for just a company to do. And by having basically a small army of crowdsourced advocates, it's totally possible. But like, why do developers do this? Why do developers spend their time and their mental energy and their resources to organize events, to do blog posts about things they like, to share in communities of practice and communities of product? That's going to lead us to our last hot take of the day. And that is, developers love marketing. Now, this might get me in trouble in developer communities because a lot of developers will tell you that marketing is some BS and they hate it and they think it's ridiculous and there's no need for marketing. Um, but developers love marketing. And if you don't believe me, take a look at most developer laptops. This post is from Alex Patel on dev.to from a few years back. She posted her laptop and she said, hey, post your sticker collections, right? And that post had like 155 comments, I think, and a lot of them were showing off their laptops and their stickers. And if you look, not all of these stickers are companies, but some are. And really, I dare you to go make a comment about anything React, negatively speaking, on Twitter. Go post React is terrible, React is the worst thing to JavaScript ever, and just see what happens. I wouldn't really recommend that because there's a very vocal user base that wants you to know that React is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So why do developers take such strong stands about the communities that they're in? There are a lot of things that can go into this, but if you ask me, and Orbit for that matter, there's one big thing to think about when it comes to getting a passionate community up around your product. And it all has to do with like a capital V, value. And it's not like, hey, I want money, right? It's actually this idea that the best communities, and for that matter, the best products, create far more value than they capture. Capture meaning consume back in, right? So what this means is that a community member needs to receive, and not just receive, but perceive the amount, about like 3 times the amount of value they get from your community than what the community gets from them. So for a company, it's super easy to see what kinds of values you might get, right? To capture, you want upsell to a paid plan, right? If you're a software as a service company, you want advocates, you want people helping out in your support forums. But the more important thing is on the right side of the screen, it's the value creation. It's what a community member should be getting out of your community. And whoops, it ran off the slide, right? And again, this needs to be much, much higher than what's on the left-hand side. What's the value capture? We want to have creator plans if it's a software as a service company. We want to have active help in the community, not just from the community, but from support engineers and from the developers themselves and from community advocates and developer advocates. We want extra tools to get the job done, maybe a nicer CLI or a nicer framework. We want a sense of belonging. We want future opportunities. We want partnerships. We want open source contributions coming back into the broader community. We want promotion of the content that we create. We want inspiration for doing things better. We want advanced tutorials on how to get the most out of the product. We want all these big things. And if we're given these things, we're gonna be a loyal brand person. We're going to want to share our expertise because we, as we share our expertise, are being given value from the community, from the product, from the company. So it's very, very important as we're thinking about how we go about creating communities, especially communities of product, that we raise up our community members. And in doing so, the community is the tide that's going to raise the product, right? We don't really need to worry as much about marketing to developers if we have a community. The community is the marketing to developers, and that sense of belonging and that sense of, for good or ill, the tribalism that comes with that is very much where we get this vocal user base for our products or our open source communities or our services, that sort of thing. So a quick recap of what we've already discussed today. Humans are innately communal creatures. We survived, and in fact, we're selected because we formed these powerful community bonds. They allowed us to adapt culturally instead of biologically because we could do that much, much faster. The diversity that comes in from being able to adapt culturally makes us that much stronger. The history of dev communities is the same as community in general. We have a topic of interest that we're passionate about, and we seek others that are passionate about it as well, kind of no matter what. Because of that historical context, communities exist no matter what. If we don't actively lead a community, it will devolve into something less than worthy for our aspirations. If a community is bad, that is directly tied to the overall experience of a product or service. A user will get their job done fast, discover more about a product, and become a power user much, much faster because of a community. And finally, because of all of the value that we create in the process of doing community creation properly, we inspire developers to have a high level of brand loyalty, and that's going to prove to that developers do love that marketing, specifically if it's community-driven, community-led marketing. And this has been a lot around like how to form a community that's worthy of a product and how to work in products for communities. But it's also important for the developers in the audience to think about these things and to think about community. Even if you're not going to be a DevRel or a dev advocate or a community advocate or a community manager, there is still a lot that you can get and feel and be a part of in a community that is outside of that. So why should you care about community as just a developer and not a developer advocate? Well, being active in a community opens doors. I listed out a ton of value that product companies can offer folks, right? But why should you be active in a product or a practice community? Well, being active in a community is about building relationships. In communities of practice, the ones that I built in the past, those relationships that people built inside these communities landed them jobs, like concretely landed them jobs. Those relationships also helped the agency that I was a part of when I was building my first communities of practice hire people. People wanted to work with me. People wanted to work with the speakers that I had that would come from my agency to talk because they were passionate about a subject. They wanted to work with these people who were passionately spreading this information. They wanted to work at a company that was so community focused as well. Not to mention all that, teaching and helping a community helps build your expertise, both internally to yourself, but also externally. It helps build your brand that you are somebody with this expertise. And when you're confident in those skills, you're much more likely to share that in a much larger audience. Sometimes for good or ill, you build yourself a brand. But here's a big one. And I think it needs to be talked about a lot more. You get a lot of that value, right? You produce content or you grow expertise or you get education, but you also shape the products for the communities that you're in, about the tools that you're passionate about. If you're an active and trusted member of a community of product, your product feedback is invaluable. And in fact, you'll see feedback that you've directly given start to get incorporated into a product. And that is an absolutely amazing feeling. It is Really, really awesome. So that's being active in a community, and that opens doors. But also being a community leader can be even better. It lets you build a ton of relationships. It lets you learn a whole lot of skills. And so that's going to lead me to a bonus context. So I alluded a little bit to my own story at the beginning of the presentation, about how I got into community building. I had a user group. I think it's an educational experience. So let's maybe spend a few minutes on it, because maybe I can push you in the way that someone else pushed me. So first and foremost, while I'm going through this, because it's the last bit of the presentation, as Brian with an I has mentioned in the chat, be sure to post questions. I'll definitely field any questions you have once we get through it. So now's the time to get in the queue and get that going. So let's go back in time, way, way, way back, right? To 2011. At the time, I was working for newspapers. I was building websites for newspapers. And it was a lot of fun. I liked newspapers. But as you might guess, newspapers in 2011 weren't lucrative or stable. And so the good time I was having working corporate at a newspaper was destined to change. And the company I was working for decided to shutter the entire corporate development and design staff, which was about like 30, 40 folks. But no hard feelings. They gave me like 6 months to find a job and like a really great severance package. So like, hey, no hard feelings. And also at the time, I happened to move from where I'd been living back to my hometown of Memphis. So in that time, I had a chance to find a new job. I found work at a little agency. I also discovered a small but like super active Python user group in Memphis called MemPy, I believe. I've been working in Django at this news agency. So I felt like this would be a great networking opportunity. Go learn a little bit more about Python. I was a front-end developer. But as it turned out, there wasn't actually a lot of work for Django front-end folks in Memphis. You had to like really know Python, and I still don't really know Python. But it introduced me to some really awesome people that are still my friends today. Anyway, I landed a job at that small agency handling their user experience work. So at the time, that literally meant I was a professional whiteboarder. I liked it a lot. I like whiteboarding. So while I was working there, I had the opportunity to work with the local PHP user group leader. His name was Joe Ferguson. He's still super active in the Memphis community. He's active in the PHP community as a whole as well. And again, he's another friend that I've made that I'm friends with to this day. And in talking with him, I really bemoaned the fact that we had all these great user groups, PHP, Python, Ruby, all these great ones, but they were all like specifically backend focused. And there wasn't really a user group for front-end development. And I was a front-end developer. I was a UX person. And he gave me a piece of advice that his mentor in the PHP community had given him. And that was, if there's no PHP community or PHP user group in your area, you are the PHP user group. Go make it. And so that sank in a little. I didn't immediately go take action on that until a little bit later in that year. That was about 2012. I got my first chance to speak at a conference, a really small conference in Memphis. I literally spoke in front of, I think, 7 people, which was fun and nerve-wracking and terrible and amazing all at the same time. But in the hallway track, and again, hallway tracks are where community bonds are forged, Joe told me that he wanted to introduce me to someone who had been idly talking in similar, though slightly different ways of starting a JavaScript user group, not entirely front end, not design, JavaScript. And so from there, the Memphis Web Workers were born. And that was the meetup group that I ran. I partnered up with Eric Terpstra, still, again, a good friend to this day. And for the next 5 years, Eric and I ran the user group until he moved away. I ran it for another year until I moved away. And it was great. We got to experiment, like I said, with a whole bunch of different things. We did a monthly meetup where we ran talking pizza kind of scenarios, but we also did that code pen challenge at like a huge arcade. We did a NodeBots building day. We did that twice, and that was amazing. We actually got like 16 and 17-year-olds in for that as well, and that was super amazing. But this didn't actually happen in a silo. As I mentioned, I'd attended the Python user group. My coworker led the PHP user group. There's also a .NET group, a Ruby group, a Java group, and then we started Web Workers. And all these groups were disconnected. We shared a locality, so technically, we shared a community, right? We shared Memphis as a community standard. But there was no singular gravity that pulled us all together. There were these little pockets of gravity and no central point of connection. And then we had some rocket ships. I mean, people, I guess, that would go in between these groups. There were people who just loved the user group scene, and they would go between them. But again, no centralized space for a community to actually thrive. We were hosting events, we were meeting people, we were seeing people over and over again. So there was community happening, but we weren't tending to the broad community as a whole. And so a few of us in what was kind of considered at the time like the new guard of the community in Memphis, we banded together from the relationships we'd already kind of forged as we were creating our user groups. And we created this thing called the Memphis Technology Foundation. And we put all of our resources together. It was technically a nonprofit. I'm still somewhat involved with it today, not significantly. But we started building relationships amongst all the group leaders. And we started connecting things together. We created resources to help make everyone have a cohesive community. We shared information about the other events that were happening. We created a free to use community meetup account that any of these community leaders could do. And if you want to create your own user group, we mentored you in how to do that. We shared the people that we knew that were good resources for sponsorship. We let you have access to the meetup group. We created a Slack community for it all. We helped each other find speakers in the community and outside of the Memphis community. And twice a year, we started hosting a super user group where every 6 months, all the user groups would cancel their meetup and push everyone into the super user group. And we would host 5 or 6 different talks that night across a really broad range of things. We also ended up building a yearly hackathon, and we kept our original annual conference going. And all these things wouldn't have been easily possible with just those little pockets of gravity. We needed that kind of central solar gravity to really band it all together and to adapt culturally so that we could build a cohesive and thriving community that was resilient. It's still going on today, even though I'm 700 miles away. I don't take an active part in the community anymore. I'm not part of that community of locality anymore. But it's still so resilient because those interconnected natures made it much, much stronger. So a few things I've learned along the way that if you want to build your own community of practice, wherever you may be, I highly recommend it. First, start the community. Like if there is not a community for a language that you are passionate about, again, you are that community. You are that user group. Find a good recurring sponsor. And I'll say this, it's okay. Recruiters are actually a great source of sponsorship. They usually only want like 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning of a meetup, and they will pay for the things that you need. And they usually do it on a monthly basis, and they work out of individual marketing budgets. It's great. Recruiters are fine. Don't worry. Have a co-host if you can. If you're sick one month, your co-host is there. Don't worry about it. If they're sick, you're there. Don't worry about it. And then grow just beyond your user group. If there are other user groups in your community, if there are other communities, little pockets of gravity in your community, go for that, right? And then you can also, even if you don't make your own community, if there is a community either in your locality or broader in this grand global community that we have, offer to speak, come to events, talk to other people, build the relationships, because those individual relationships are what build a higher level of gravity and a stronger community around each of these communities. Building relationships is the key there. And really, as you kind of do these things, whether you're helping to lead and to grow, or you're building from scratch, the skills that you learn along the process are invaluable in any career, not just as like a developer advocate or as a community builder. They can make your day-to-day life much easier as well. You'll be a better communicator. Since you won't find a speaker every month, there will be lulls where you can't get anybody to speak. You'll learn to be a good speaker because you'll have to fill those gaps. You'll also learn much more details about the technologies you're passionate about because you have to learn them well enough to present. You'll learn about managing events. You'll learn about cool technology that you can seek out people to come talk to because they'll be willing to talk to a meetup group. You'll learn how to manage timelines and run events and do all these things, all because you did these things, all because you built a community, all because you were an active participant in a community. So this is the kind of thing that not just makes you stronger as a dev, but again, going back to that historical context, it's going to make you stronger as a human because we are communal creatures. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and say that it's Q&A time. And we'll bring Brian back on and we'll talk QA. But also, I understand you might not want to ask in chat and you might like to talk in private and all that sort of thing. So hit me up on Twitter @BRob, or come join Orbit's Discord because we talk about community building in there. You can hit it up rob.dev/Discord as well.
Oh my God, Rob, that was awesome. And I could talk to you about it for probably the rest of the afternoon. But I will.
I'll clear my schedule. Clear my schedule, everyone.
I have so many thoughts. So yeah, so and you hit on so many important points. And to before I get to questions, I want to like emphasize that last part you talked about. As somebody who's been doing this myself for a long time, I've gotten as much out of it as like more out of it than I gave in many, I'd say. Even things like CFE Dev. I mean, I started it because like I wanted to see these presentations. Like these are things I wanted to see, and I'm learning
Exactly.
it. I'm not just here running it, I'm here learning as well. And I feel like I've been introduced to so many different people who have made connections for me, but also like I've learned a lot from everything they've presented about things that I knew nothing about. But by the end of it, I learned a lot. So I think your point that being involved in the community can really give back more than you end up having to give, right? Like
Just about
you
every time.
receive
Yep.
more. Yeah.
Yeah.
So excellent point there. We did get one question so far, but please, folks, feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A module. So Amy has a question for Brian, but that's you.
With a Y. You got to pronounce the Y a little bit
Yeah.
stronger.
What's your favorite passion project you've worked on?
It's a tough question. So a few different ways to answer it. My my best passion project that met all the goals that I set for it is the podcast that I organized that Brian has been a guest on. Note I pronounced it with the I, called "That's My Jam Sack," and that's been very personally not monetarily lucrative, right? I pay more for that than I get out of it.
Hmm.
But I've met so many amazing people through that. I met Brian through that. Ray, who's talking next week, has twice now been a guest on the podcast, and I've gotten to learn about a whole bunch of different perspectives on the Jamstack world. So that's been pretty amazing. The hackathon that we organized that I mentioned was called Hack Memphis. That was super amazing. It was actually a hackathon that was not just a software hackathon. We wanted to bridge our hardware community and our software community. And it was a hackathon that was all about community building. You couldn't win the hackathon. There was no judge panel. It was all about getting together for a weekend once a year and building cool stuff. Sometimes bridging hardware and software, sometimes just a software project, sometimes just soldering. People would like bring their mechanical keyboard to work on. And like the amount of people who thought that I like drastically cared about hardware stuff was amazing. I would just sit there and just like listen, and it was amazing stuff. And I very much cared about their story, but like I would destroy myself and all my tools if I worked on hardware projects. Like that's not what I'm good at. But like watching them, listening to them, and seeing their passion, like every time was amazing. And like again, like a growth opportunity. I learned so much watching all that happen.
Yeah, definitely. I've been, and I've been involved in things like that as well. I mean, even to your point of like just stepping up when nobody, that's generally how I got into this stuff. I mean, like I moved. I talked about it years ago. I was doing cold fusion, um, and I was living for a brief period in a small town in Wisconsin, and we were moving to Boston. I'm like, oh, finally, I'm gonna be able to go to like a user group with like other people doing cold fusion. I got there and there was one, but it was defunct, and
Mhm.
so like I was like, "Ugh, okay." So I just started it, and then I wanted to be able to go to like a conference about some of the stuff, and
Yeah.
my company wouldn't pay for it. So I'm like, so I'm like, okay, well, I'll just start one here. And so it kind of everything kind of evolved out of that. So I think, it's not always easy to do those kind of things. It's not always, as you mentioned, from what do you gain out of that
Yeah.
individual thing, like even CFE, to be honest.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say, it advanced my career enough that I more than made up for whatever I spent on these things over the years. So, um,
Legitimately, I'm not here talking to you today if that meeting with Eric Terpstra didn't happen in mid 2012. I'm not here at Orbit.
Yeah.
I'm not at any of the opportunities I've had in the past few years. I I'm still probably working at a small agency in Memphis, which is fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I'd probably still be pretty happy. But like where I'm at now doesn't exist without starting that community a decade ago now.
Yep. Yeah, and the thing that we have I run something similar to what you were talking about in Memphis here in Orlando called Orlando Devs. It's also not for profit. We also have like a group meetup account to like for everybody. We try to have like more community events and stuff like that that are broader community. And the other thing that gives me personally a lot of satisfaction is just how many people we've helped get jobs, how many people who furthered their career, like how many people who like this was their first opportunity like to meet somebody who wasn't like they just getting into coding, and they've never really even had a talk with other developers, and so all those things, like, just it's not even just about how does it affect you, it's like you can have such an impact on other people.
Yeah. We do have another question coming up.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, what risks does the developer advocacy slash community world face moving forward? There's always risks, right? I think some of them kind of go into the idea I talked about near the beginning, which is if you're not building your community in the way that is to build strong bonds within the community, you run a lot of risks about that, about losing one member of a community team or a developer advocacy team and the community crumbles, or you run the risk of not building the community in a way that supports itself. And then you have to hire 50 community advocates and that doesn't support itself.
Hmm.
Or you build a company that has one community advocate, one developer advocate, and they only can do so much. And so they have to focus on like what brings initial value, right? And that then means that people get left behind in the community, and that creates a bad community experience. And that bad community experience, like that, directly correlates to bad user experience of a product because the community is a pillar of the product. Also,
Yeah.
there's a lot of buzz, right? And anytime there's buzz, there's problems to be had about like people really pushing various types of agendas around things. But also, like as we move into this kind of more corporate-y space, I think we can look at the history of DevRel and developer advocacy and know that there are various pitfalls that can leave a poor taste in someone's mouth. That can get very marketing-y heavy. You'll notice, like in general, I showed no screenshots of the Orbit platform today. I didn't really talk about Orbit that much. I just wanted to kind of share my take, and by extension Orbit's take, on community and developer communities and stuff like that, and give some value and not say go sign up for my product, right? And we sometimes run into that, especially when we get into like developer evangelism and like tofu growth, top of funnel growth, and all those things. It can very easily leave a poor taste in the mouth, and that
Yep.
can lead to the entire industry of DevRel, the entire industry of community management, getting a bad rap. And so as more and more people are getting into that, having proper thought leadership in place goes a decent distance to make sure that that we don't have bad actors that end up poisoning the well of what community could and probably should be.
Yeah, and I would add to, like, I think you've kind of touched on it, but there's oftentimes, I think, one of the risks in DevRel, particularly at smaller companies, is that the expectations of it are so high.
Yep.
It's like, okay, we brought you in and you're like a superstar and you're gonna suddenly, when you join, we're gonna have like tons of new followers, and we're gonna have, huge, our Twitter following is going to go crazy, and our traffic is going to boost, and and it's, that's not the way it works really. And
Yeah.
one of the things I end up going, it's like, because you got to be careful not to focus so much on what am I going to, it was in your slide, and then what are we getting out of this, right? Like, I'm like, okay, but what are we giving?
Yep.
Like, because this is more about, like, you have to build it that you have to put into the bank before you can withdraw, kind of thing.
And
And yeah, a
there,
lot of
there's
companies don't do that.
there's a lot of and Erin, who's in chat, and she actually asked the last question. She's a community advocate at Orbit as well, and we have lots of like in-depth, passionate conversations about this stuff, which is great. But we both have like product and like UX type backgrounds, and it's amazing like to think about. There are so many overlaps to what like UX is and what community building is. And part of what I used to say when I was a UX professional, like doing those whiteboards, right, was always like, what do I give the user coming to the site in order to be able to ask them for something, whether that is
Hmm.
paying for a product or signing up for an email newsletter or something like that. What have I given them to let them know that this is going to be valuable to them? So what we do in community is also like, what are we going to give to them to make it so that they want to give more to us? And it's always got to be like 3x the value. It's always got to be huge. I think that goes for like for product conversations as well, like broader than just community. Like when you
Hmm.
start talking about pricing and when you start talking about product strategy around that sort of thing, the value that a user gets out of your product has to be of an order of magnitude larger than what they're paying into the product. Otherwise, they'll find something cheaper, they'll find a workaround. And so it's the same with community. I think there's so much that we have to like make sure that we're giving to make that work.
Absolutely, yeah. It's and it can be a tough lesson, because it, you want, obviously, especially particularly if you're a small startup or something, it's you want to see like immediate. You need to show some immediate impact, and it's like, okay, but DevRel isn't always like, in community work isn't always like, it's like a garden where you plant the seeds and you nurture them, and then if you do things right, it'll grow, and then it's self-sustaining, and then it really gives back. But it's like, until you do that kind of initial work, gardening, like, you aren't going to see the fruits of this ever.
When we were doing some strategy work at Algolia, myself and my coworker, the newly reformed developer advocacy team there, we were doing a whole bunch of strategic work and like walking the company through like the vision for DevRel in the future. And one of the things we talked about was this idea that we don't want to just create content that gets people in the door. What we want to do is we want to build advocates in the community that do that for us, because there's two of us. We can write X number of blog posts, create X number of videos a month. If you want to scale that content up, you have to hire 5 more of us. And that is something that doesn't scale in the way that we kind of want to. But if you provide value to champions and give them all the tools they need and give them the value they seek when they create things,
Hmm.
they want to create things around your product. And by doing that, you take your 3-person advocacy team and you make it a 20-person advocacy team and a 50-person advocacy team. And theoretically, that builds on itself on the momentum, because the more of those people you have, the more people want to do that sort of thing. And it's a flywheel, right? Whatever
Yeah.
that means. But yeah.
Yep. I think that goes back to your point of like, if the community exists, whether you manage it or not, and even pieces of that community will, like, there may be champions, you're just not caring for them. And so there exists out there, you're not taking advantage of them.
Yeah, you have potential champions who are going to very quickly, as we would say in orbit, float back out into space, right? They've come
Yeah.
very close to the center of your gravity because they like your product. But as soon as they realize that they're not getting cared for, they do less and less and they float back out into space, and they're not your champions anymore. And that's
Yep.
not their fault. That's your fault.
Yep.